Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 559, The Otaku, Part 1. In my time doing this show for, at this point, over 10 years, there's been one topic that has tended to make the top of the charts in terms of listener requests, which, by the way, just to clarify, I do always take, even though I never guarantee I will actually produce an episode on a given subject. It depends on what's available in terms of the research. And this particular topic, well, actually, I think the people who suggest it don't always think of it as a singular topic. But when I get asked to do more on the cultural history of anime or manga, or something on the video games industry, or a request for a history of Tokyo's unique neighborhood of Akihabara, I see all of those things as connected to each other. What's really being asked for, in essence, is something on a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, otaku culture. Now, otaku is a term with a lot of meanings. I am legally obligated to remind everyone whenever I talk about this subject that its original meaning is simply one's home. The term can also be used as a pronoun, and from there made this jump into referring to a whole subculture that covers a variety of different kinds of media and represents a certain kind of attitude towards hobbies, one might say, that it has become associated with. When the word otaku first started to be used this way in Japan in the 1980s, it had a very negative connotation, sort of like the contemporaneous stereotypes from 1980s America of the archetypal nerd. And yet, just as nerd culture has risen up to conquer popular culture in the US, to such an extent that we all go to see comic book movies, that Star Wars is the most valuable IP in the universe, and that movies featuring absolutely ludicrous characters like Doctor Strange and Krang can make like $1 bazillion, otaku culture has also kind of conquered a lot of Japanese popular culture, at least from a certain angle. It's also become this selling point overseas. Every single person I know who works in teaching something related to Japan, from language to politics to literature, has mentioned something like the following story to me. You see, once upon a time in the distant and magical land of the 1980s, Japan-related academic programs in the US were flush with both cash and interest. Much of that interest came from more conventional, clean-cut types, people doing business degrees, hoping to go into politics, something like that, who wanted to pick up some knowledge of the language or history or culture of a country that was looking more and more like it was going to remain the second largest, or possibly even become the largest, power on Earth. And then, of course, came the collapse of Japan's bubble era in the early 90s, at which point, once it became clear a lot of Japan's economic problems weren't just a blip, a lot of those people and their precious money left. Not all, mind you, but a great many turned their attention instead to places like China or South Korea that had rising economies and were potentially lucrative markets for the USA. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, came a new wave of students, whom these old-school academics at first did not understand at all. They wanted to learn Japanese, not to do business deals, but to read manga without having to wait for translations. They wanted to study Japanese politics, not to understand the diplomats or politicians they might one day work with, but to get references in their favorite anime. In other words, an American generation that was influenced by otaku culture had become the new core constituency of English language academia on Japan. And that's pretty fascinating to think about, because one of the interesting contradictions of this whole subject emerges sort of from the jump. On the one hand, otaku culture, whatever we might term that as, is something that is often viewed as distinctly Japanese, as bound up in our idea of Japan as other internationally famous and equally somewhat problematic concepts like the geisha girl or bushido or whatever. And yet, otakudom has become this international thing, something that has its own power in many ways because it's not distinctly Japanese, because people around the world are into it. Which, to be fair, is also kind of true of ideas like bushido or geisha, but that's a whole different series. So over the next few episodes, I want to engage with this question: what even is otaku culture? Where does it come from? Why does it have this enduring power, both in Japan and overseas? But I want to be clear about a few things first. The most important thing to say is that this is not going to be the type of series where I go through and narrate the history of famous anime or manga fandoms in chronological order for a couple of reasons. First, and probably most importantly, I don't think that's going to be of interest to anyone but people who were already fans of those things. And to be frank, I think those people would do a better job narrating that history because, and this might surprise you all, I don't actually read that much manga. I don't watch that much anime. I don't really play that many Japanese video games. Mind you, I do enjoy some of the fine byproducts of otaku culture. I played a good number of Japanese video games in my time, and for reference, the objectively 3 best Japanese games ever produced are Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy IX, and Skies of Arcadia, and this is just a fact that we all have to accept. I've watched some of the great classics of anime, but certainly not everything. I never got into Dragon Ball, never watched Evangelion, any of that stuff. I don't think I could do a good job narrating a history of otaku culture that is focused on what came out of it, as you could get from the average fan forum. So instead, I'm going to focus in areas where I do think I can offer you something more unique, something more useful, and that brings us back to that question from earlier. What even is otaku culture? Where does it come from? And why does it have this sort of enduring power? That's something I think I can work with pretty well, because it's less of a history of specific fandoms and more of a history of ideas, questions, social movements that, as we will see, really matches pretty well with the wider social histories of Japan we've already talked about. First things first, though, what even is otaku culture? And almost immediately we run into a problem here. Probably the most famous academic work on that subject is Otaku, Japan's Database Animals by Azuma Hiroki, and in that text, Azuma describes what he calls otaku-kei bunka. His translators render this as otaku culture, though more literally it would be something like culture derived from otaku-related things, as follows. Quote, "Due to the complex situation noted above, in the 1990s, lengthy discussions were carried out among otaku concerning such issues as what are otaku, what is otaku like, who is an otaku and who is not. However, speaking from my own experience, it is impossible to reach a conclusion on such issues, and even when tackled, they merely lead to an emotional exchange over each person's identity." In other words, this is a term that is both very complex to define and very attached to people's self-concept and identity, and therefore, trying to figure out what it means is always going to be pretty loaded. Azuma does go on to note that there are only 2 basic characteristics to otaku culture as he sees them. First, that the various otaku subcultures emerged out of the cultural mix of 1960s Japan, and second, that there were 3 basic generations to them, more or less demarcated by the decade that their members were born in, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which in turn shaped the nature of the anime and manga they consumed. To my understanding, there's never been a second edition of this text, but one imagines that if there had been, Azuma would add 3 more follow-up generations from the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. I guess these would be the early internet otaku, the mature internet otaku, and, I don't know, the skibbity toilet otaku. And if you don't know what that means, ask your nearest 13-year-old and prepare to be very confused. Azuma's not the only one who had a hard time defining this term. As Ito Mizuko notes in her essay on the subject, quote, "For some, otaku evokes images of sociopathic shut-ins out of touch with reality. For others, and increasingly, it suggests a distinctive style of geek chic, postmodern sensibility expressed through arcane knowledge of pop and cyberculture, and striking technological fluency." And yes, this is your warning, we are going to have to talk about postmodernism in this series. You have been warned. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is that even getting people to agree on what otaku means, to say nothing of this wider notion of otaku-kei bunka or otaku culture, it's pretty challenging. Is otaku a relationship to anime or manga or other cultural forms that are viewed as related to them, like video games? Is it a personality type? Is it a worldview? Ask different people, you'll get different answers. And the whole thing becomes even more complicated because, as far as I can tell, the oldest manifestation of what came to be labeled as an otaku culture, substantially predates the purported origin date of otaku culture in general in the 60s and 70s. These are the folks we're going to spend the rest of this episode talking about, the so-called Densha Otaku or Train Otaku, a subculture with roots going arguably back to the Meiji period. Dr. Tsuji Izumi, who is both an academic and a self-described train otaku himself, has written a fascinating essay on this very subject, one in which he appears to have been, well, working through some things, let's call it that. What do I mean by that? Well, witness an actual section of the introduction, quoted here precisely as translated, quote, "This fact that train otaku are not associated with anime, manga, and other modern otaku traits does not necessarily mean that train otaku are fully committed to real society. They tend to be socially awkward, and the vast majority of them have never had relationships with real women. Because of these tendencies, train otaku tend to be placed on the bottom rung of the male social ladder. I have been a train otaku from childhood, and I remember having no choice but to belong to the lowest caste throughout my junior high school and high school years in boys' schools. In boys' schools, the most important criterion for belonging to the highest caste is to be popular with real girls. Most of these popular boys are jocks. Those attached to fantasy girls such as anime otaku belong in significantly lower caste. Train otaku, who indecisively fail to commit to either reality or unreality, are consigned to the lowest caste." I don't want to make light of anyone's school year's trauma, we've all been there, but this is an academic essay, man, maybe not the place. Anyway, Tsuji's core argument is that train otaku are a sort of otaku prototype, the first manifestations of the subculture, and he identifies the origins of this subculture as lying in pre-war Japan, in the era when trains had status as a symbol of modernity. Now, we did a whole series on the history of rail in Japan. The first one in the series is episode 384, if you're curious, so I'm not going to rehash too much of that here, but it's worth recollecting a bit. Rail technology, you might recall, was one of the most prominent and early symbols of the power of the industrial West during the final years of the Tokugawa shogunate. Commodore Perry gifted the Tokugawa shoguns a miniature working railway as a part of his expedition, intended to impress the shogunate's bureaucrats as an example of advanced Western technology. In Nagasaki, meanwhile, a Russian visitor, Yevgeny Putyatin, set up his own miniature railway to show to the lords of Kyushu for similar reasons. And clearly this all worked, because once the shogunate fell apart, the new Meiji government spent a lot of money and time building up a national railway network, both for its practical, economic, and military uses, and as a symbol of the government's commitment to modernization. Trains and rail were, of course, eminently practical demonstrations of the new government's power, and, of course, useful to boot. But they were also big pieces of powerful technology that attracted the interest of young people, especially young boys. As Izumi puts it, quote, "Most Japanese men have the experience of becoming enamored by trains at least once in their childhood. Toy trains are fixtures of boy culture, and one can always find them in a toy store. Although not all boys go on to become train otaku, these early childhood experiences provide an entry point for those who do." And by the way, you'll note the very gendered nature of that quote. That's something we'll get into more next week, less so this week. Anyway, fascination with trains among young people, and especially young boys, during the imperial period was not an accident. It was not something that existed purely because trains are big, cool machines, and young people in general tend to find those interesting, and are often encouraged in those fascinations. Don't get me wrong, that all helped, but it wasn't the only factor. The other major factor was that this interest was actively encouraged by media targeting young boys. For example, the magazine Kodomo no Kagaku, or Science for Children, which was founded in 1924, dedicated its entire first issue to model train building. For magazines like Kodomo no Kagaku, this was a practical choice. Model trains were an interesting subject that would probably drive interest and money into the publisher's hands, but they were also a practical habit to encourage in young boys from a patriotic perspective. After all, A boy who got interested in trains because of model train building might grow up to become an engineer and thus be a very useful subject for the empire, at a time when state propaganda and state policy really encouraged young people's education to be geared towards being useful to the state. This all did great numbers for Kodomo no Kagaku. The magazine's issues on model train building were so popular that eventually it ended up sponsoring a contest, and the magazine later partnered with the contest's first winner to set up an entirely railway-focused magazine in 1929 called, uninventively enough, Tetsudo, or Railway. Magazines like Kodomo no Kagaku did not, however, focus entirely on model trains as the only subject appropriate for young boys. Competitions like the one I described existed alongside competitions for, say, building model airplanes or model battleships. Thus, as Tsuji Izumi notes, train otaku and another subgroup, the military otaku, spring from more or less the same source in the same period. This sort of model building culture aimed at pre-war young boys, and of course, building models is still a big part of otaku fandoms today, though of course in a very different context. Unlike the train otaku, the military otaku culture in Japan was badly affected by the Second World War and defeat, which then saw the inauguration of a new, more pacifistic post-war culture where obsession over building military models was, at least for a time, seen as kinda strange. After 1945, Japan was no longer the nation of Fukoku Kyohei, of rich nation and strong army, as that old Meiji-era slogan had put it. It was a country focused on looking away from the military and towards economic growth and recovery, a better future symbolized by the rebirth of the national economy, and of course, trains work for that. A focus on the military does not. The military otaku culture never really went away altogether. You still see shops dedicated to, for example, buying and building model fighter jets, or the equivalent of realistic airsoft weaponry. But the military otaku today are not very numerous, and particularly in the early post-war era, the train otaku culture was at its height. You see that pretty clearly in testimony from the period. For example, witnessed an interview with one Wakuda Yasuo, born in 1934 and one of the founding members of Tokyo University's train club in 1955. Quote, "As someone who had grown up during World War II and received a militaristic education, I loved battleships and planes as much as I did trains. But with Japan's defeat in 1945, both the army and navy vanished, and the train was what remained." And Wakuda was not the only one who felt this way. For example, Keio University had a pretty active train modeling club, first established in 1936, that was discontinued during the war years and then reopened by a student, Saito Akira, in 1953. Here's what Saito had to say about his interest. Quote, "Speed, strength, courage. The workings of these machines are an open book, inspiring human longing. The experience of having encountered them never leaves one's mind. Battleships, planes, and trains all exude a masculine magnetism." Saito, by the way, wrote not one but two whole books specifically on the subject of trains. Here is a brief quotation from the foreword of one of them. Quote, "Steam locomotives are not merely a means of transportation. Our longing for distant unknown lands and the memories of our joys and sorrows meld with the distinctive smell of coal and the rhythm of the wheels on rail joints sinking deep into our hearts. And despite being a hulking mass of steel, the locomotive's belabored climb up inclines and dancing rods makes it feel like a living thing. It is more than just a machine." And this might all seem a bit overwrought, but I do kind of get where he's coming from. When I was a kid, I loved model planes and space shuttles, a little more up-to-date technologically for a child of the 90s, but more or less the same idea. I never went to a shuttle launch at Cape Canaveral or anything like that. Florida's not really my scene, but I watched footage of them. I thought they were really cool, and I loved planes too. Back before 9/11, when you could go up to the cockpit as a kid and get shown around, I always loved doing that. I kind of get the fascination, is where I'm coming from. Of course, as a super cool kid, I also loved my toy X-Wing and Enterprise D, even if, as an adult, I can acknowledge that Ben Sisko was a superior captain. And the thing is, trains were cutting-edge technology before the Second World War, and they did feature in some pre- and post-war science fiction as a result, which maybe accounts for the future otaku angle, so to speak. If otaku culture originated in the train otaku and then spread to other parts, other subcultures in modern Japan, maybe the fact that trains have this science fiction association earlier in their history helps sort of prime the pump there. But that's just me speculating. But one does have to imagine that a young person interested in trains in the 1960s and beyond would find them pretty science fictional. As older school steam engines were being phased out by electric trains and the beginnings of the Shinkansen bullet train network were being put together for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, I can see how the sleek new technologies these achievements represented would really make it feel like the future was arriving. And if you're a young kid in 1964 who sees his first Shinkansen bullet train and then goes home to, for example, read a pulpy sci-fi novel by Japan's premier sci-fi press, Hayakawa, probably equivalent if you're a sci-fi person in the US to something like Bane or Tor, and in that story there's a futuristic train, well, I can see how you might start drawing some connections there. Anyway, as all this might suggest, the hobbyist train fandom really exploded during the first 2 decades of the post-war era, with several new magazines growing up to cater to fans such as Tetsudo Fan or Railway Fan, and eventually even websites for those interested in exchanging photos or discussing specifications for new models. And especially as the economic rebirth of Japan progressed, more and more people could afford to invest heavily into this hobby. Some even quit their more traditional jobs to pursue it full-time. There was enough demand that if you wanted to, say, start a business making model trains, you could. And the fact that this became a real economic driver driven in part by members of the fan culture, well, that's part of why you could label this as the first modern otaku fandom. Interestingly, among these train fans, because remember, otaku as a term is not in use yet, there was also a growing sense of nostalgia. The 60s and 70s were marked among the train fan culture by what's called the SL boom and the blue train boom. SL in this context stands for steam locomotive. In the 70s, the last steam-powered trains were being phased out by Japan Rail, and when that news hit the wider public, there was a huge boom in fans trying to ride them or get a photo one last time before they were mothballed. This was such a big thing that there were actually fan magazines publishing timetables for the remaining steam-powered trains so you could plan your ride. Blue trains, meanwhile, were long-distance overnight trains marked by their distinctive color and made obsolete by modern bullet trains, which cut down travel times so much that slow-running overnights were just not a need anymore. And once again, there was such a big rush to ride these, get photos and the like before they were phased out for good. And again, even though none of the people involved in this would have called themselves otaku at the time, their focus on collecting experiences, knowledge, physical reminders, models, magazines, photos of the things they were interested in, that's all pretty recognizable in any modern fan culture, in anything today we might label as otaku-like. So we're getting into the late 70s, and here's where there's a bit of a shift in this culture that a lot of academic authors talking about the history of otaku get into, and because of that, we have to talk a little bit about postmodernism. I'm going to do my best to make this as painless as possible, and in the offing, I am very likely to piss off some postmodernists with my simplified versions of their theories, but what are they going to do, deconstruct some meaning at me? Anyway, starting in the 1970s in the developed world, you start to see a very interesting cultural shift. Broadly, across America, Europe, and Japan, economies are becoming less and less focused on production and more focused on consumption, so-called service economies, where rather than the main focus being the production of physical goods, you're producing something more abstract, you're fulfilling a need. Which is all well and good, but can also be a bit alienating. After all, when you are making something concrete, you really understand what it is you're producing and how that's contributing to society. But if you are, say, working a white-collar office job all day, it's easy to lose sight of how the numbers you move around in your spreadsheet are actually changing anything of importance. And this can lead to a sense of estrangement, of detachment or disconnection from a society that's rapidly changing, and which is increasingly hard to make sense of. And this is where the theories of the French sociologist Jean Baudrillard come into the equation. Baudrillard's most famous text is called Simulacra and Simulation, and it was first published in 1981, This basically is the core of his argument, and by the way, I'm going to simplify a lot here, because I don't think any of us are mentally, emotionally, or even spiritually prepared for a deep dive into French postmodernism. Anyway, Baudrillard says that we are so fundamentally alienated by modern society that meaning itself, in a certain sense, no longer functionally exists. How can that be possible? Well, because our own realities are increasingly constructed of symbols that are more and more detached from the actual world. Constructing those fake representations, according to Baudrillard, is what our society has actually become focused on. This is particularly true in modern times because in the past we tended to have shared cultural narratives, a shared story as Americans or Japanese or whatever, about who we are and where we're headed as a culture or a nation, but in modern times, media has become so fragmented that we no longer share these narratives. Instead, we've become focused individually on symbols or signifiers that are attached to whatever we personally find interesting. We have, in other words, become a society where we put a lot of focus on individually targeted derivative creations that are based on reality, but not representative of actual reality. They're too abstracted from it. We like movies, not the news. We watch the weather report, but don't just look out the window. In a more modern context, we focus on our appearance on social media rather than our actual selves. In our world, simulacra, representations of reality that are divorced from that reality, have come to dominate. To use Baudrillard's own words, quote, "The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, a procession of simulacra that engenders the territory. It is no longer a question of imitation or duplication or even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real." Two things I should say before we move on here. First, I am simplifying Baudrillard a lot, and I'm not an expert on postmodern philosophy, so if you are a Baudrillard head, and I know there are many of you out there, I hope you find my simplifications forgivable. Hopefully, while I am producing a mere derivative copy of his ideas, they're at least somewhat related to the reality. Or maybe I'd be showing off that I understand Baudrillard better if I didn't hew to them at all. Second, this all is what makes Baudrillard's work postmodern, and more broadly, it's a pretty accurate representation, at least in my understanding, of what postmodernism actually is in philosophy. Postmodernism is a rejection of modernism, which in turn is a philosophy of, for lack of a better word, intellectual optimism. Modernism is the belief that advances in technology, in science, and philosophy, and so forth will make our world more better, more comprehensible, more efficient, fairer, and so on. Star Trek is, in a sense, the ultimate modernist fantasy. Postmodernism is a critique of modernism. It is saying the modern world is less comprehensible because of these advancements than ever before. And to be clear, I am not endorsing this criticism. There's a lot I disagree with both in terms of Baudrillard's philosophy specifically and postmodernism more broadly. For example, a lot of postmodernists don't have any grounding in pre-modern history, and Baudrillard specifically doesn't account well for the fact that the rehashing and replication of ideas is not fundamentally new or modern in any way. Hell, anyone familiar with classical Japanese poetry can tell you how circular and self-referential it is, and great works of literature from the Canterbury Tales to a great deal of Shakespeare's work are derivative from other works. I mean, the Tale of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest work of literature, is, from what we can tell, likely a work of fan fiction derivative from older Gilgamesh tales. Anyway, why did I just drag you through a brief detour of a philosophical subject that is basically the poster child for being obtuse and confusing, while also saying that I think a good chunk of it is wrong? Well, because in the 70s and 80s, postmodernism was coming into its own. Remember, Simulacra and Simulation was published for the first time in 1981. These ideas were academically cutting edge when a lot of the first academic works studying otaku culture came out, and because of that they frame a lot of discussions on otaku culture. In fact, only 2 years after Simulacra and Simulation was published, one of the first Japanese works to use the word otaku in its modern context was published for the first time. This was an essay by the comedian and cultural critic Nakamura Akio, who used it to describe unpleasant fans of pop culture phenomenons, which he published in a magazine called Manga Buriko. Nakamura may or may not have been the first to use otaku as a word in this way. It's a bit unclear who was, but he was certainly one of its biggest popularizers. And Nakamura has this to say about otaku culture in his essay, quote, "Come to think of it, manga freaks and comiket, a type of manga fan convention, are only the start of it. There's those guys who camp out before opening day on anime movies, dudes who nearly get themselves run over trying to capture photos of the blue train as it comes down the tracks, guys with every back issue of SF magazine and the Hayakawa science fiction novels lining their bookshelves, science fair types with Coke bottle glasses who station themselves at the local computer shop, guys who get up early to secure space in line for idol singers and actress autograph sessions, boys who spent their childhood going to the best cram schools but turn into timid fish-eye losers, guys who won't shut up when the topic of audio gear comes around. These guys are normally called maniacs or fanatics or at best nekurazoku, the gloomy tribe, but none of those terms really hit the mark. For whatever reason, it seems a single umbrella term that covers these people or the general phenomenon has not been formally established, so we've decided to designate them as the otaku, and that's what we'll be calling them from now on. Much has been made of Nakamura's essays, which, as this excerpt probably gives you a sense of, are rather tongue-in-cheek in their style. But what I really want to focus on are the ways in which what Nakamura is describing fits Baudrillard's ideas very well. After all of these otaku tribes he's describing have one thing in common, a sort of obsession with possessing or understanding the symbols of whatever type of otaku they are. Maybe that's the most complete collection of photographs of the old blue sleeper trains, to the point, as Nakamura says, of almost getting yourself run over getting them. Maybe it's a collection of autographs from your favorite J-pop idols. Maybe it's being the first to see a new movie or get the latest piece of tech gear or whatever. All of these are signifiers in the Baudrillardian sense. You're not producing something new or original. Anyone could go see that movie or get that piece of gear or photograph or autograph as long as they put in the effort. The meaning attached to it is meaning of the simulacra, the meaning that is self-referential. The meaning was, however, by the time Tsuji was writing, the first decades of the 2000s, was starting to feel a bit thin for the train otaku fandom. Tsuji noted a growing sense of pessimism among his fellow train otaku. The collective discussions of the group were starting to feel like they were rehashing the same things over and over again. Ever since the big electrification wave of the 70s, nothing much had really happened in the world of trains. The biggest development had been the breakup and privatization of Japan Rail, and the largest company to emerge from that split, JR East, was more focused on diversifying out of rail, for example, into what eventually became the Suica card system, than on new models of trains. And so among the train otaku, the focus increasingly became this sort of constantly rehashed nostalgia. The SL and Blue Train booms were just the first step in this turn towards fixation generally with the past, because it felt like trains didn't really have a future. Tsuji actually interviewed a fellow train otaku on this question, a younger member of the group born in 1978. He'd become fascinated with trains as a kid, he'd joined his college's train club, he found a job at one of the JR companies. Yet he told Tsuji, quote, "There is no future in trains, they've fulfilled their purpose." Tsuji in turn says this in regards to this pessimism, quote, "It appears as though the culture of imagination, a longtime province of Japan's male youth, is reaching a certain endpoint. It is as though imagination is no longer expanding towards an aspirational time or place, but is instead fixed in the here and now, capable only of expanding internally and heralding a new kind of obsessiveness." And this is where I want to put a pin in things for this week, because I think this is the first interesting revelation we get looking at otaku culture from a more academic perspective. You see, I imagine that your image of guy who is obsessed with trains is probably, if we're being honest, not the most complimentary one. It's okay, this is a safe space, you can admit that. We tend to ascribe to such people, or to others with similarly obsessive fanishness, a sort of individual neurosis, a notion that something is wrong with them individually. We also tend to view these people as a novelty, being part of a fandom, in other words, a group of fans associated with the same thing that's a new cultural phenomenon. What Tsuji is suggesting is that this is wrong-headed. That sort of fan culture has existed longer than we think, whether it's being fans of trains or movies or theater. Current fan cultures are evolutions of those interests, not something new. The extreme nature of otaku fandom, meanwhile, is not an individual thing, it's a cultural phenomenon. It is an expression of modern imagination, our desire for fantasy, coming against a society that is increasingly Baudrillardian, focused on simulacra and symbols rather than reality itself. Otaku, according to Tsuji, are more honest about the nature of our society than the rest of us. They don't pretend to care about anything other than the abstract symbols of belonging or identity within their fan culture, while we all pretend we don't care about how many people like our posts on Instagram or whether or not our favorite movie of the year gets recognized for how great it is. Next time, which is not next week because this is the last episode of 2024, we'll pick up with some other otaku subcultures, and I promise there will be less postmodern philosophy. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about the network at facingbackward.com, and you can support this show via the History of Japan Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in 2025 for the continuation.